Alexander the Great conquered more of the known world before the age of 32 than most empires managed in centuries. He never lost a battle. He broke the Persian Empire apart with his bare hands, marched his army to the edges of India, and built a kingdom that stretched from Greece to the Himalayas. Then he died at 32 in a borrowed palace, and everything he built collapsed within a generation. None of it was inevitable. It happened through a chain of decisions that each made perfect sense in the moment, and each carved something vital out of him or his empire. This is how the greatest conqueror in history destroyed himself, one mistake at a time. Burning Persepolis. In 330 BC, Alexander burned the royal palace of Persepolis to the ground. Ancient sources, including Diodorus and Plutarch, describe a drunken celebration that ended with the palace in flames, possibly at the urging of an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who reportedly called for the destruction as revenge for Xerxes burning Athens 150 years earlier. Alexander either ordered it deliberately as a symbolic act or allowed it to happen in a moment of drunken theater. Either way, he watched the greatest architectural achievement of the Persian Empire turn to ash. At the time, it looked like a statement. He had already declared himself the legitimate successor to the Persian throne, but the Persian nobility was watching carefully, weighing whether to accept him or resist him. Burning Persepolis sent a message about what happened to those who defied him. It felt like power. What it actually did was permanently undermine his claim to be a legitimate Persian king. You cannot burn a people's most sacred royal site and then ask them to love you as their ruler. Persian nobles who might have integrated peacefully into his administration instead held a quiet, lasting resentment. It was the moment Alexander chose spectacle over governance, and he would make that choice again, killing Clitus. In 328 BC, during a drunken banquet in Maracanda, Alexander killed his own cavalry commander, Clitus the Black, with a spear. Clitus had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus years earlier by cutting down a Persian soldier who was about to kill him from behind. He was one of Alexander's oldest and most loyal officers. During the feast, Clitus drunkenly criticized Alexander's growing adoption of Persian customs and his dismissal of Macedonian traditions. Alexander, also drunk, grabbed a spear and ran him through. The argument had escalated the way arguments do when both parties are intoxicated and surrounded by people too afraid to intervene. Clitus was saying things that others were thinking but would not say. Alexander had heard enough. The aftermath was catastrophic for morale in a way that no battlefield defeat could have matched. Alexander reportedly spent 3 days in grief, refusing to eat or speak, which his commanders found alarming for entirely different reasons than the murder itself. The men who had followed him across thousands of miles now watched him kill a decorated veteran in a rage over dinner. The trust between Alexander and his senior officers never fully recovered. It planted a seed of fear that would grow into open mutiny within a few years. Adopting Persian customs, Alexander began wearing Persian robes, adopting Persian court ceremonies, and surrounding himself with Persian nobles and administrators. He attempted to introduce proskynesis, the Persian practice of prostrating oneself before the king, to his Macedonian officers. This was not a small cultural adjustment. To Macedonians, proskynesis was an act reserved for gods. Asking free Macedonian soldiers to bow like Persian subjects was an insult with no diplomatic translation. Alexander's reasoning was genuinely sophisticated. He was not just conquering Persia. He was trying to rule it, and ruling it meant being accepted by its people. Wearing their clothes and honoring their customs was statecraft, not vanity. His historian Callisthenes and others simply could not see past their own cultural assumptions, but the result was a fracturing of his inner circle that proved irreparable. Callisthenes was eventually arrested on charges of conspiracy and died in custody. Other officers grew cold and distant. Alexander was trying to build a multicultural empire, and instead built a court full of men who felt alienated by the king they had bled for across a decade of campaigning. He was ahead of his time in vision and behind in execution, and the gap between those two things cost him dearly. The march through Gedrosia. In 325 BC, returning from India, Alexander led his army through the Gedrosian Desert in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. Ancient sources suggest the march killed somewhere between 1/4 and 3/4 of his army through heat, thirst, and starvation. It was one of the single deadliest episodes of his entire campaign, and it was entirely self-inflicted. Alexander had been told the route was brutal. He chose it anyway, reportedly because he wanted to outdo Cyrus the Great and Semiramis, legendary rulers who had allegedly attempted the same crossing and failed. It was a competition with the dead, conducted at the expense of the living. Tens of thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and support staff died crossing that desert. The army that emerged from Gedrosia was physically broken, psychologically shattered, and deeply angry. These were men who had already pushed past the limits of what any army in history had been asked to endure. The Gedrosian March was the moment many of them stopped believing Alexander's ambitions were worth following. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River in India had already told him his men had limits. He ignored that warning and marched them into a desert anyway. The execution of Philotas and Parmenion. In 330 BC, Alexander executed Philotas, one of his senior cavalry commanders, on charges of conspiracy. Philotas had reportedly heard rumors of a plot against Alexander and failed to report them, which was enough to condemn him. Then, because Philotas's father Parmenion was Alexander's most experienced and senior general and could not be left alive knowing his son had been executed for treason, Alexander had him assassinated in Media without a trial. The logic was coldly rational. Parmenion commanded vast resources and loyal troops. A grieving father with an army was a threat Alexander could not afford. Eliminating both was the efficient solution. What it demonstrated to every other senior commander was that loyalty offered no protection. Parmenion had served Philip of Macedon before Alexander, had fought in nearly every major engagement, and was arguably the most important military mind in the campaign. He was murdered because he was inconvenient. Every officer who heard the news quietly recalculated their own position. The relationship between Alexander and his high command became transactional and fearful, where it had once been built on genuine loyalty forged in shared danger. Ignoring succession, Alexander never named an heir. He had a wife, Roxana, who was pregnant at the time of his death, but he made no formal arrangements for what would happen to his empire if he died. For a man who planned campaigns across thousands of miles with extraordinary detail, this was a staggering omission. It likely felt unnecessary. He was 32. He had never been defeated. He was already planning campaigns into Arabia. Death probably felt like an abstract problem for a distant future. Rulers who believe they are invincible rarely make contingency plans. When he died in Babylon in 323 BC, reportedly of fever, though poisoning has never been fully ruled out, his generals immediately turned on each other. When asked who should inherit his empire, he reportedly said either the strongest or said nothing at all, depending on the source. What followed were the Wars of the Diadochi, 40 years of his former generals destroying each other and everything he had built. His son was eventually murdered as a child, his mother was murdered, his wife was murdered. The empire was carved into pieces that spent generations bleeding each other. Everything Alexander conquered was lost not to an outside enemy, but to the men who had helped him conquer it. He built an empire with extraordinary care and left its survival entirely to chance. The final banquets in Babylon. In the weeks before his death, Alexander engaged in extended drinking sessions in Babylon that ancient sources describe as increasingly extreme, even by his own considerable standards. Plutarch describes a banquet hosted by a Thessalian named Medius, where Alexander drank heavily over multiple days and became seriously ill shortly afterward. Whether the illness was caused by alcohol, disease, or something more deliberate, he was already in poor physical condition before it struck. A decade of wounds had accumulated. He had been hit by arrows, spears, and a sword that collapsed a lung. He had pushed his body through deserts, mountain passes, and river crossings that would have broken men who had not also been fighting. He was not invincible. He was a heavily damaged 32-year-old who was drinking like he was still 20 and untouchable. He died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, after roughly 12 days of illness. He could not speak at the end. His soldiers filed past his bed to see him one last time, and he reportedly acknowledged them with his eyes because he had nothing left. The greatest conqueror in history died in a borrowed room with no plan, no heir, and no empire that would survive him intact. Every decision that brought him to that room had seemed like the right one at the time. That is almost always how it happens.